Since the dawn of recorded history, many things have changed about society. But one constant that has remained are combat sports. Humans have always had a desire to compete in feats of strength and agility against an opponent, and the viewers have always loved watching. Wrestling is considered to be a universal sport. It was present in almost every society that has ever existed. We have found cave drawings of the sport dating back nearly 15,000 years, as well as hieroglyphs from ancient Egypt and Babylonia, and statues from ancient Greece. Other forms of combat have been present for similar amounts of time. Our first record of boxing dates back to nearly 3000 BC in ancient Sumer. In China, a sport that combined boxing and wrestling called Lei Tai was incredibly popular during the Song dynasty. Europe had many forms of combat sports, one of the most popular being jousting. Today is no different, except now our combat sports are televised. Boxing is one of the most popular and lucrative sports, with the top athletes netting hundreds of millions of dollars in earnings. Floyd Mayweather is considered the greatest boxer of all time, and holds the record for the largest purse from a single fight, in which he earned $280 million for a fight against lightweight Conor McGregor. Conor also earned a sizable purse from the night, walking away with $130 million. One up-and-coming sport is mixed martial arts, or MMA for short, and the leading organization is the Ultimate Fighting Championship, which started bringing televised fights to viewers in the 90s. It has been a long battle for the UFC to absorb and retain viewers away from more popular sports, but now, in 2021, it appears that the UFC has finally found its way. They didn't achieve this without a lot of hard work by many organizers and athletes, but there has been plenty of scandal along the way. One of the most common critiques of the sport is that the fighters are paid far less than athletes in other sports.
There seems to be, at least among some of the fighters, a desire to get paid more. We can all imagine that would be the case, of course. But, speak to me about this idea that basically you lock in fighter income at around 18% of gross profit, and a lot of other sports closer to 50%. And a lot of your fighters say, hey, we'd be happy for something more than 18%. Why can't we get it?
Yeah, that's been going on for 20 years, too, and it'll be going on for the next 20 years. I don't think you're ever going to see a scenario where you see a fighter, or anybody, for that matter, saying they're overpaid. And you're always going to have a certain level of guys that feel like they're being paid enough. You don't hear the guys that actually bring in the revenue complaining about pay. Like a
Can I say
common
one thing about that?
No, I know, but hold on. All right, but what Jake Paul, even, who you did pay really well, I mean, even he's on you, Dana. He's saying, come on, maybe it's time to pay your fighters their fair share. No wonder they all want to get into boxing.
Hey, that bum didn't fight for me. You got to get your story straight. He didn't fight for me. He's out there complaining about fighter pay.
Oh, that's right. Here's what I would say about this,
He wanted to sign with us. I wouldn't sign him.
I'd say the following. Since 2005, our fighter pay is up 600% for a sport that he created 25, 30 years ago. So I think we're doing pretty well and created a sport for all these fighters. We're up 600% since 2005.
Right.
The UFC has endured many lawsuits from previous fighters, claiming that they were taken advantage of by the organization, with profits not being evenly shared between the fighters and the organizers. Let's take a closer look at the history of the UFC and its relationship with its fighters. Does the UFC exploit its fighters? Keep watching to find out. Before we get into that, please make sure to give this video a like and leave a comment. It's going to help us reach more viewers and level up our content. Thanks in advance. Let's dive in and learn a little bit about the history of the organization. Many believe that the UFC was founded by current president Dana White, but that's actually not true. The first UFC event was held in 1993 in Denver, Colorado, in which there were minimal rules and no weight classes. Art Davie, a well-established businessman, approached John Millis, an esteemed director, and Rorion Gracie, a Brazilian jiu-jitsu master, about putting together a first-of-its-kind mixed martial arts tournament called War of the Worlds. He approached Gracie specifically because of a series of videos put together by the Gracie family, in which jiu-jitsu masters defeated masters of other martial arts disciplines, such as karate and kickboxing. What propelled the tournament to success was the use of a new form of revenue generation for televised events: pay-per-view.
Pay-per-views. Let's sell some seats and tickets and pay-per-views.
At at the time, pay-per-view was just starting to become popular due to major networks such as HBO and Showtime starting to use it to broadcast live sporting events. The UFC, then called WOW Promotions, capitalized on this new system. It's one of the main reasons why the first tournament was a success, and this system continues to be the main revenue source for the organization, which doesn't typically rely on sponsorship from major networks when putting together its events. What's funny is that these pioneers in mixed martial arts didn't think that they were creating a new sport. The tournaments they put together were making money through pay-per-view, and they just decided to keep the train rolling by putting together more tournaments. In the beginning, the fighters were typically masters in only one martial arts discipline. This differs greatly with the fighters that exist today. All of them know multiple styles and can use them interchangeably during a fight to subdue their opponent. In the late 90s, the sport was scrutinized by Senator John McCain, who saw the sport as a human equivalent of cockfighting. This set off a series of laws enacted by states to curb the dangerous nature of the sport, and it seriously hurt the organization, which had to navigate ever-changing laws and regulations. It brought them to the brink of bankruptcy. In 2000, a group of businessmen sought to purchase UFC from WOW Promotions. They bought the UFC for $2 million and formed Zuffa LLC. Many criticized buyers Frank and Lorenzo Fertitta and Dana White, stating that they threw away $2 million for a worthless franchise. But the Fertittas and White disagreed. They understood the power of brand name recognition. Without it, they realized they would basically be starting from scratch, whereas if they owned the name, they immediately had brand recognition with millions of viewers. From there, it was a long uphill battle as the organization continued to fight regulatory red tape, but they persevered, and with new ownership, they were able to obtain new sponsorship and better advertising. They started The Ultimate Fighter, a reality TV show about MMA fighters who were competing for a $100,000 UFC contract. This show was a massive success and helped solidify UFC as the #1 MMA organization in the world. The 2000s decade was a period of massive growth for the organization. They started selling out larger arenas and garnering more pay-per-view customers than ever before. But in the early 2010s, they hit a large snag, a lawsuit with previous UFC fighters over wage and contract issues. In 2014, a group of former UFC fighters claimed that the UFC was restricting their earnings and operating the organization as a monopoly. They started a class action antitrust lawsuit against the organization, in which they claimed that the contracts that the UFC imposes upon fighters were unfair and anti-competitive. Upon first glance, it certainly appears to be the case. The UFC's contracts are incredibly restrictive and are aimed at protecting the organization above all else. Unlike in other professional sports, there is no athletic association which negotiates on behalf of the fighters. The result of this are some really unfair line items in the contracts, such as, number 1, the UFC controls all rights to the fighter's name, likeness, voice, persona, and biographical material. Essentially, they own the fighter's identity. And they own this in perpetuity, not just during the time period specified in the contract. This means that the UFC can use the fighter's likeness for basically any purpose it chooses, and they owe nothing in terms of compensation to the fighter. White and the Fertittas have disputed the claims that this is unfair, arguing that even though they aren't required to compensate the fighters, they typically do so anyway through various bonuses. They also claim that they have this line item in the contract because the televised fights are the only real asset that the UFC has. But the reality is, they could do so much more against the athletes' wishes if they wanted to. Number 2, the UFC requires that athletes participate in promotions for events at a moment's notice. This has caused a lot of pain for the fighters, who, if they're preparing for a challenging match, don't want the additional stress of undergoing interviews and photo shoots. There are obvious reasons why this is included in the contract. The UFC has to promote the event somehow. However, the wording in the contract basically means that the fighter doesn't have any say in where, when, or how they engage with this promotion. Number 3, included in a fighter's contract is a champions clause, which basically states that the UFC can extend a fighter's contract for 1 year or 3 fights if the fighter becomes a champion. This part of the contract has never been challenged legally, but some experts have said that it's potentially a violation of the 13th Amendment, involuntary servitude. To me, this part of the contract makes a certain amount of sense, because if the UFC spends a considerable amount of money building a fighter up, the organization should be able to reap the benefits of the televised pay-per-view matches when the fighter is at their best. That said, the fighter should be able to negotiate their rates at this point in time. Number 4. Fighters are not allowed to talk about how much money they make from fights. This is a huge difference between the UFC and basically every other professional sport. Many have criticized this stipulation because it basically means that the UFC can pay the fighters much less than they're worth, and they can't talk about it with other fighters. If the fighters were to create an athletic association, this would surely be one of the items struck from future contracts. Number 5. The UFC has the right to match any other contract offers from other MMA organizations for 1 year after a fighter's contract is up. This basically guarantees that the fighter will stay with the UFC, even if they don't want to. Critics have claimed that this is a clear exploitation of fighters who can't exit a contract and make money as an independent contractor. Number 6. Most contracts with the UFC prevent fighters from engaging in contracts with other MMA organizations or even with outside sponsors. This clearly seems like a violation of the 13th Amendment, but Zuffa has said that there is very good reason for it. Because they work with cable networks to maintain a certain number of matches every year, they have to be able to assign fighters at a moment's notice to matches. If they had to work around every fighter's schedule, it would be an impossible task. There are many other criticisms of the UFC from previous fighters, but these points should outline the clear powers that the UFC possesses over the fighters. If the fighters were to develop a fighters association, a lot of these problems would be resolved through collective bargaining, which has helped athletes in virtually all other professional sports. It's unclear whether a lot of these issues have been fixed since the class action lawsuit in 2014, which is still not resolved, but it's doubtful. Without order from the government, an organization like the UFC will want to hold on to all of the powers that it can, so that it can make the most profit that it can, and continue to expand the sport. In 2016, Zuffa sold the UFC to William Morris Endeavor for a valuation of $1.7 billion. Not a bad profit for the Fertittas in white, who bought the franchise for only $2 million just 16 years prior. The UFC continues to be a moneymaker for Endeavor, which had some really bad quarters due to COVID in 2020. The UFC carried the company to profitability during this time, as fights continued despite restrictions on many professional sports leagues. In the end, the UFC is continuing to expand, bringing in more viewers and having stronger cards than ever. While fighters have complained about the amount of money they make for years, new fighters such as Conor McGregor have shown that you can still make hundreds of millions of dollars through the sport. I personally love the UFC, despite its flaws. It's a fantastic example of how brand recognition and a unique business model can propel a new business to amazing heights. I can't wait to see what happens in the future. I wouldn't be surprised if it becomes one of the premier sports leagues in the world. Hey guys, thanks for watching the video. Make sure to like and subscribe and share this video with a friend. Thanks.